Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about perceptual decisions. But I appreciate that some of you may immediately think, decisions, it's a bit of a vague term. And I probably agree with that. I think many people, myself included, have overused the term decision making, partly in order to sell their work to high-impact journals and make it seem more relevant than it really is. I think one thing that justifies using the term decision making in this context is because we often think about the judgments that we get people to make in kind of decision theoretical frameworks. So that's one reason why I use the term decision making. But of course, everything in psychology is decision making. We always ask people to produce some kind of motor output. They also have to press a button or move their eyes in some way, move their hand or foot. So it's not a particularly meaningful term. The other thing I want to say is I'm going to address a couple of questions in this talk that to some of you may seem like very obvious questions that were settled ages ago, but what I hope to convince you of is that they weren't, at least not in the domains that I'm talking about. So some of you from a reading background, for example, may think, well, God, the answer is obvious. But I think for those of you who don't study reading, like me, I don't think that's the case. Okay. So just some preliminary remarks. So when I talk about perceptual decision making, really what I'm talking about is inferring the state of the environment from some sensory data. So the example I often give is: imagine you're about to cross the road. It's a situation where you have to estimate whether it's safe or not to cross, okay? And that decision is linked to a choice of an appropriate course of action. Okay? So you either wait on the pavement, or you initiate your walking route and you cross the road. We also know, and teaching grammar with psych here, that picking up that sensory information is an active process. Okay? So when we talk about vision, the resolution of our visual system is such that we have to get the information from multiple locations. So if you're about to cross the road, you obviously have to look to the right and to the left, to the right again, and the information that you pick up in those separate glances has to be somehow put together into some overall judgment about how safe it is to get across. Okay? So each of these sampling decisions, an individual fixation, serves a larger kind of overall goal. And the information that you're acquiring during a fixation is used for that larger overall goal, namely to get across the road. Okay, so we know that we pick up visual information during periods of steady fixation. What we have to do during a fixation is, of course, analyze what we're currently looking at. Okay, I will refer to that as foveal analysis. We also have to select where we're going to look next. Okay, I will refer to that as target selection or peripheral selection. And we have to decide when we're going to move on. So we have to do those three things. And do we understand these three processes? And this is where I said, for some of you, depending on where you're coming from, you think, yes, obviously we have a pretty good handle on these things. Okay? So, here's my kind of limited reading of the literature. This is by no means an exhaustive list. Okay? So if you're someone who works in reading, then you might think, okay, yes, we've got good models of eye movement control in reading, and those models embody certain assumptions about how we deal with foveal analysis, how we select the target for our next fixation, I say kind of here because target selection in reading is obviously a much more constrained problem. Okay? In most of the cases, you just go to the next word unless something else happens, in which case you might go back or you might skip a word. And those models are very good at accounting for fixation durations, how long you stay on a word when you move on to the next word. In this corner here, things are reasonably well worked out. That's a fair statement, isn't it? But in non-reading domains like visual search or scene perception or lower level ocular motor control, I don't think that's the case at all. So most models of visual search, so here's the target acquisition model, the Greg Zielinski, Ideal Searcher by Bill Geisler and colleagues. They really only talk about target selection. So these models make predictions about where you're going to fixate, but don't have anything to say typically about the sequence of fixations or how long you would stay in one place and then move on to the next location. And typically they have nothing to say about foveal analysis. I've put a dash here for these models because what those models do is basically assume that you have some target template and that you match that template with the incoming image in all possible locations in parallel, including the fovea. Okay? And the information that you're matching it to is just better in the fovea. So there's nothing inherently different about foveal and peripheral processing in these models, other than the quality of the information. Other models of visual search, like the saliency model or the contextual guidance model, again, they really have nothing to say about foveal analysis, as far as I understand, and really are just about predicting which locations are going to be visited. In scene perception, a model like CRISP is really only about fixation durations, okay, and has nothing to say about how foveal analysis and peripheral selection are conducted. So I think, across these domains, our understanding falls a little bit short at the moment. So in ocular motor control, people study kind of very basic visual search tasks, target selection problems. Some people study these kinds of problems while recording from single cells in awake behaving primates. And in that domain, I think some model has emerged that takes care of these two components, peripheral selection and the when decision. And this is something to which I have made at least some contribution. So this is the sort of work that I've done more of than I should have done, probably. So this isn't really a search task, but it's kind of a target selection task. Okay, so this is a very simple experiment where we just get you to fixate in the center, we present you with two patches, and we say, okay, look at the brighter one. Okay? And we can model your eye movement, your eye movements in terms of which of these two patterns you're going to look at and when you're going to look there. In terms of fairly intuitive but quite powerful models. Okay? So what I've illustrated here is a kind of canonical model based on accumulating evidence to a decision criteria. Okay? So in this task, you've got two possible target locations. So you might have two movement programs. You can think of this as kind of activity on a motor map. And what happens is that over time, evidence in favor of these two movement programs comes in and is accumulated. In this case, if your task is to look at the brighter target, then the evidence in favor of the brighter target would rise more quickly compared to the evidence in favor of the non-target And at some point, this evidence gets to a threshold, and at this point you initiate your eye movements, or at least after a short delay, after reaching that decision criteria. You can see that these lines are a bit squiggly. We assume that there is noise in the system, so that when you accumulate this evidence, you also add noise to it. And of course, because of the noise, sometimes you end up looking at the wrong patch. Sometimes you end up looking at this one. So these models are very good at accounting for variability, both in the choice probabilities and also in the saccade latencies. So here's an example from one of my papers. This is data from a single subject, and we're modeling the whole distribution of eye movement latencies for both correct responses and error responses. So this model made predictions with the same set of parameters, made predictions about the proportion correct and the latencies of the correct and error responses, and the latency distributions. So in some ways that's really quite impressive. You can do really nice things with these models. So for example, you can imagine doing certain experimental manipulations. You can manipulate the quality of the sensory evidence, for example. So the brightness difference between those two patches can be small or it can be large. According to these models, that should translate into differences in the rate of rise to threshold, and that should generate very clear predictions about how the choice probabilities and the latency distributions change. So when you collect data from that kind of experiment and you fit this kind of model, it will often identify this kind of mechanism. It will say a change in the rate of accumulation is the best account of these experimental data. So that's really elegant. It's really nice. And it's a nice integrated account of the when and where, target selection and the when decision.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
So when you talk about evidence accumulation, are you speaking very abstractly, or do you see this actually kind of mapping onto the systems involved in generating saccade, like Superior Click Lie or something like that?
I think of it fairly abstractly. The way I think about it in the context of this kind of task is that you have some sensory response to the onset of these two patches. The sensory response will be larger to this patch than to that patch, and it's those sensory responses that you're integrating over time. That's how I think about it. So, yeah, sure, I could, match those components with different parts of the brain, but I always think, especially in eye movements, people always talk about the colliculus because that's where most of the recordings are done.
Right.
And then you speak to people who record from the frontal eye fields, and they find pretty much the same things as the people in the colliculus. But actually, your question reminds me of something that I wanted to say. So people doing single cell recordings from, say, the colliculus or the frontal eye fields, LIP, they find traces that actually look a little bit like this, and that seem to reach a common threshold, which is then followed after some fairly constant delay by the actual eye movement response. So these models are, these models have a very long history in experimental psychology. They account for these kinds of data very well, and there seems to be some neural evidence that this is what's going on in the brain. So it's all very nice. Okay. And I've done a lot of work along these lines, but one of the conclusions I'm going to draw today is that I no longer think this is a very good way to think about things. Okay, so here are my two specific questions that I want to address today. So one problem with all this target selection stuff, as I came to realize in the course of the last 3 or 4 years or so, is that typically in all these experiments, you've got to select a peripheral target in the absence of any kind of foveal processing task. Of course, that's a bit strange, because we move our eyes to a location in order to extract information from that location with the higher resolution foveal. So the work I'm presenting today is kind of my attempt to start thinking about foveal analysis a little bit more seriously. So one question I'm asking is about the temporal coordination between foveal analysis and peripheral selection within a fixation. The other question I'm going to ask is to what extent the when decision is controlled by foveal processing or target selection in the periphery. The second question I can deal with fairly rapidly. The first question I'm going to spend a little bit more time on. I'll spend a little bit more time on this, partly I think because I think we've got an interesting methodology that may be of interest to people here, and it's a little bit involved, so I want to make sure that you understand it properly. Okay, so with regard to the coordination of foveal analysis and peripheral selection, here's one way to think about the various possibilities. Okay? I'm sure to most of you this is very familiar. So imagine you have a fixation duration, it's a fairly long fixation, on the order of about 400 milliseconds. So one way to think of it is that within that fixation you've got a period of time dedicated to foveal analysis and a period of time dedicated to processing information from the periphery and selecting your target. Okay? And then of course you can go the entire continuum from serial to parallel. So in serial you're doing foveal analysis for some period of time, and when foveal analysis is complete you do the target selection bit. Okay? So in kind of sequential attention shift models you might say, okay, well attention shifts at the point where foveal analysis is complete. Of course you can bring this forward a little bit, so then you have a kind of cascaded model. So here you would say, okay, well some criterion amount of foveal analysis has to be completed before attention shifts to the periphery. And then of course you can bring it all the way to the beginning, in which case you have a completely parallel model. You do both things at the same time. So the way I think about these little curves are as kind of temporal weighting windows. Okay, so these specify what weight is given to foveal or peripheral information over time. So, to address this question about the coordination between foveal analysis and peripheral selection, it would be really nice if we could measure these temporal weighting windows. And that's exactly what we're going to try to do. But this is difficult, right? Because fixations aren't very long, and figuring out these weighting windows involves figuring out what information people were processing at what point in time over a very brief time scale.
So in this analysis, you're assuming that the type of information used for foveal and parafoveal processing is exactly the same?
No. So I think at this stage I'm making no such commitment.
Okay.
When we get to the experiment, actually you'll see that the peripheral selection is based on completely different information than foveal information. And I think that's important to the interpretation of our findings. I think things may well turn out differently if the relevant dimensions are the same. Yeah. Okay. So here's our crazy task. It is crazy. But people can do this. I'm just making sure that this keeps moving because it doesn't play without projecting. Okay. So we get people to make a comparative tilt judgment. So it's a very basic kind of psychophysical task, but I think in some ways the task is not that important, but it allows us to do what we're doing. So what I'm trying to do is mimic this idea of you having to fixate several locations, pick up information from those locations, and then put that information together somehow in order to make some overall judgment about the world. In this case, a bunch of wiggly patterns. So, your task is to do a tilt comparison. So you start off fixating in this central location, and then you get a number of vertical patches, one at fixation, 3 in the periphery. After some delay, you can see that these patches start wiggling. I'm just going to have to keep walking back and forth. Okay. You see that they start wiggling. So all of them have a mean orientation that's slightly offset from vertical, either clockwise or anti-clockwise. At the same time, when they start wiggling, one of the peripheral patches will have a slightly higher contrast than the other two. It's difficult to see on this setup, of course, but it's the top one in the first trial, and I think it's the left one in the second trial. Not sure about that. Anyway, so now your task is to compare the direction of tilt offset of the central pattern with that of the high contrast peripheral target. Now we've set up the task so that these tilt offsets are really difficult to see in peripheral vision. So what you really have to do is, it's getting a bit annoying. What you really have to do is, you extract some tilt information from this location, you select a target based on contrast, you move your eyes there, analyze the tilt at that location, and then make a comparative judgment. So a number of things that are critical here. I think people have seen enough of that. So a number of things are critical. So one is this idea that foveal analysis and peripheral selection here are based on different visual dimensions. That's important. But what that allows us to do is shove noise into both dimensions. Okay, so that's what the wiggling and the contrast fluctuations were about. So each patch has a mean tilt that's offset from vertical, but there's some spread around it, and every 2 video frames we draw a new tilt sample. Okay, so on average, the thing will be tilted clockwise or anti-clockwise. And the same for contrast. So one patch in the periphery will have a higher contrast than the other 2 patches, and every 2 video frames we draw a random sample from that distribution. So the critical idea to understand our method is that noise at a particular point in time can only influence your behavior if that noise sample was processed in some way. Okay, so if it fell within this temporal processing window. That's the critical idea. Because what it allows us to do is to look at correlations between noise at particular instances of time and your behavior, or aspects of your behavior. There's nothing elegant about this. You have to.
So the noise is going in 2 dimensions, right? What form of noise is it?
So maybe the sequence here makes it basically. So it's just normally distributed noise around a mean tilt offset.
Is the noise in relation? So it's in relation to the size of the tilt. Is that right? Or?
Yeah. So for example, the tilt offset might be 1 degree or vertical, and then there's a standard deviation of about 6 degrees around that. And so you might get a sequence of 0, 4, 2, minus 2.
But there's no noise in the contrast.
And there's also noise in the contrast.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so this little sequence here kind of makes that clear. So here the top one is actually the target, but you can see that on this 3rd frame here, actually one of the peripheral patches has a slightly higher contrast than the target. and that's just because of the random sampling. So as I say, there's nothing elegant about this. You end up having to run a huge number of trials in order to, well, actually, you can get away with running much less than this, as we've learned since then. You can probably get away with running about a third of this, and you would still replicate the findings. Okay. At the end of this sequence, we ask you two questions, actually. So one is, what was the tilt at the original fixation location? And the second question is, was the tilt of the peripheral target the same or different? In a way, that second question is not really of any interest to us. It's just to kind of mimic this idea that you pick up information from various locations and put it together. What else should I say? I should also say that we don't actually give, this is not an eye movement task. It's a, you just have to make this perceptual judgment, but in order, of course, we structured the task so that in order to make that judgment, you have to fixate the right patterns, and you have to do it within a brief period of time. If we gave you a lot of time, you would just leisurely look at each pattern in turn and make a decision. So we have to restrict the time to force you to be selective with that first eye movement and try to aim for the high contrast target. Okay, that's all I need to say. So it is a crazy experiment in some ways. Actually, people pick this up fairly quickly. So we give them a few blocks of practice. After about one block of practice, people at least know what the task is, and then they need another couple of blocks to kind of stabilize their performance. So here's what we do with the data. So I'll talk about foveal analysis first, and then we'll move on to peripheral selection. So for foveal analysis, what we're interested in is this first fixation on the central pattern. And what we've got on any given trial is a sequence of noise values for that pattern. And we've got your eventual decision about that pattern. So was the thing tilted clockwise or anti-clockwise? So imagine that the true tilt of this pattern is clockwise, but you get to see, let's say, -3, -1, and 0 as your first three samples, okay? Where minus is anti-clockwise. Well, in that case, if those three samples, if you weighted those three samples really heavily, then you might actually say, well, this pattern is tilted anti-clockwise. Okay? So the noise here would induce you to make an error. I mean, we can, in some sense, this is not really an error, but it's an error because the true tilt of the patch is clockwise. So that kind of suggests the analysis that we've done here. So what we can do is we can look at trials where you made the correct judgment, trials where you made an error judgment, and we can look at the noise samples leading up to those judgments. And that's what I've done here. So this is aligned on the start of this test sequence where the patterns start wiggling. 0 here actually means the true tilt of the patch. Okay, so if the patch had a tilt offset of 1 degree clockwise, we've got a sequence of noise values around that, we subtract 1 from that. And so positive values are now tilt samples that tilt the thing further in the correct direction. Okay, so if it's 1 degree clockwise, then these tilt samples would be 2, 3, 4 degrees clockwise. Negative means tilt samples that tilt the thing in the opposite direction, towards the error judgment. Now, if you closed your eyes and just responded randomly, then these noise values should have no predictive power over the judgment that you're going to make. To the extent that they are predictive, we should see a separation between these two lines. And you can see that we do get a very clear separation between those two lines, particularly early in time. They gradually converge. One reason they converge here is because at some stage people move away from this patch. They look at one of the peripheral patches. And so now this central patch is in peripheral vision. And there's some variability with, some variability in the fixation duration. So this triangle here is the median latency. So this is data from one subject. So this is a median latency. And you can see that after that point, basically these two curves lie very close together. So one thing you can do to address that is to align the data on movement onset instead.
So just let me just look at this graph a second.
Yeah.
So those little triangles are the scale onset latencies, right?
Yeah, so this is 25th, 50th, 5th percentile.
And so they're moving their eyes about 300 to 400 milliseconds after the things start with them.
Yeah.
And you're seeing an increased influence of the noise.
I'm seeing the largest influence right at the start of the trial.
Yes, but how do you? So I see. So what you're saying, the timeline along the bottom, along the x-axis, is when the noise was inserted into the.
Yes.
What frame the noise was inserted into the foveal stimulus, right?
Yes. Yeah. So time zero here is effectively the start of the trial. So you get, we start the trial with these vertical patches, and then after some delay they start weakening.
Yeah. So I can see that there's an influence on the decision component. I was wondering about the saccade onset latency. So what I was imagining, I'm getting a bit confused, sorry, it's my fault this, it's nothing about your display. The left graph, so I was imagining that the point at which you introduce the noise within the foveal fixation on the thing might be, I was imagining that the noise early on in that would be more influential than late on, because late on they've already allocated their attention elsewhere.
Right.
But that's not what you're showing. So what I'm asking, is there a relationship between when the noise was introduced and how fast they move their eyes to a parafoveal stimulus? Or peripheral stimulus? It might be not a correct question. I just thought that, I was just imagining that's where we're going with this, but it's not, right? You're basically showing this effect in relation to their decision component. But I was thinking about the attentional allocation, right? How fast they could move their eyes somewhere else, and I assume that when you introduce more noise, that's somehow going to cause them not to leave the foveal stimulus, their attention to leave the foveal stimulus with respect to selection of the parafoveal stimulus they're going to make saccade to as rapidly.
Okay, I think that's, so that's not what I'm showing here. So I'm not showing, what you're essentially asking, what is the relationship between the quality of evidence in the fovea and the fixation duration?
Yeah. And the scattering response.
Yeah. So no, that's not what I'm showing you here. I will address this point in a second study, which doesn't use this noise methodology. We've also done it with this noise methodology and get very similar spots. Yeah, and that's all I'll say. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is the same thing but aligned on movement onset. So 0 here is the start of the eye movement, the little grey box is the duration of the eye movement. And so what you can see is that these lines are separated right up to the point of movement onset.
May I ask a question?
Of course.
I'm afraid I don't understand what any point on that graph means. What is the y-axis?
So the y-axis here is the magnitude of the noise at any one particular point in time,
So how much
averaged across many trials.
So how more tilted is it at that point? So this isn't a measure of behavior.
No.
Why would it be bigger at the start? You manipulated it so it's tilted more at the start?
This is kind of what So the separation between these two lines gives you an indication of the extent to which the noise was predictive of their eventual judgment. So if I give you, so for example, suppose you close your eyes in the first 100 milliseconds of the trial, then it doesn't matter what noise samples I present during that 100 milliseconds, they're never going to influence your behavior.
I understand that.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So now suppose it's the other way around. You open your eyes for the first 100 milliseconds, but you close them after that. Then the noise samples in those first 100 milliseconds are going to be very predictive of whether you make a correct or error judgment. And the noise samples after that are not going to be predictive at all.
The y-axis is something about the predictiveness of the noise. It isn't a measure of noise.
It's a proxy measure. You could see it that way. Yeah, I don't. It's the separation between these two curves that's a measure of the predictiveness.
All right, thank you.
And why is this separation not symmetrical about the zero?
I think that's because.
So I mean, I'm imagining that reflects the fact that they're either clockwise or anti-clockwise, right? So I don't understand why that would be asymmetric.
I think that's because samples that are quite extreme, but in the opposite direction to the true tilt of the patch, are going to be more influential in making in causing errors.
But wouldn't that be so that I agree, right? I can accept that. So so if they're going to that way, but you presume that counterbalanced every trial for one going that way,
Yeah,
one
yeah,
going
yeah,
that way, right?
yeah.
So I would imagine.
So these things are coded in terms of, so positive here is more extreme in the correct direction, negative is further in the
And so
incorrect.
realistically asymmetric.
No.
So I see. So you're saying you get a greater effect when it's negative noise, positive noise.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so with this cicada line plot, what you can see very nicely is that during the saccade, two curves are bang on top of each other, and then afterwards there's not very much going on at all. But before, you get this very nice separation. So this tells us during this period of time, these noise samples were predictive of your judgment at the end of the trial. We can talk later on, I'll ignore it for now, we can talk later on why they come together again. But let's ignore that for now. If you have a question about it, say it. Okay. Right, let's think about peripheral selection. We effectively do a very similar kind of trick. It's a little bit more complex. If you think about peripheral selection, you've got these three patches in the periphery. So we've got three temporal streams of contrast noise values. Now, think about what might you make an error. Okay, so you look at a non-target patch. But if you look at a non-target patch, that may be because there just happened to be some noise samples at that location that elevated its contrast and made it look a little bit more target-like. Perhaps at the same time, at the real target location, there were some noise samples that made the target look a little bit dimmer, make it look a little bit more non-target-like. So what we're doing here is we're looking at trials where your first saccade went to a non-target. Turns out that these are the most diagnostic trials. And we said, okay, well, for those trials, let's look at the sequence of contrast noise samples at the non-target location that you chose, at the target location that you ignored, and of course there's this third location as well, the non-target that you ignored. And so what you see is that these traces do something that's a little bit like what you might expect. So here's the non-target that you chose. okay? And it's got noise values greater than 0, so that means that it looked a little bit more target-like. Okay? Just because of a random sampling, just happened to draw some noise samples that elevated its contrast. The target that you should have chosen but ignored has noise values that are negative. So therefore these are noise samples that reduced its contrast and make it look a little bit more non-target-like. We'll ignore the non-target you ignored because that kind of hovers around 0. So again, you can see that early in time, these two curves are very well separated. So the contrast noise in the periphery has some predictive power over which pattern you're going to look at. And eventually they come together. This is of course exactly what you would expect. And at some point you make that eye movement, and of course the contrast noise is no longer predictive of that eye movement. The world doesn't work.
So these decisions are saccade target selection decisions, right? Whereas the former decisions were perceptual decisions about which one was more tilted, say tilted, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So they're quite different decisions, right?
Yes. So here are the same data aligned on movement onset. So again, 0 is movement onset. You can see a good sanity check after the movement. The lines basically just lie on top of each other. Okay, so noise at this point in time cannot influence what you did at this point in time. And again, you can see a very clear separation between these two functions. They actually come together sometime before the movement itself. And this makes perfect sense. Okay, so we all know that when you select a target, there comes a point of no return, where your eye movement program has progressed so far that new visual information can no longer influence your upcoming movement. So we often call that the dead time. In models of reading, we'd call it the non-labile stage of eye program. Okay. So this is those data put together. So this is all from the same observer, just one observer. So, comparing foveal analysis and peripheral selection is difficult, partly because they do refer to quite different things, but also they're measured on completely different scales. Okay? So here we're talking about contrast noise, here we're talking about noise and orientation. I've also not shown you, these are just the means across many trials, and obviously there's some variability around these means, which I haven't shown you at all. So to address those two issues, putting things on a common scale and also taking into account some of the variability, what I've done is at each point in time, imagine this point in time here, imagine there's some distribution around these values, and there's some distribution around these values. What we can now do is, for that point in time, do an ROC analysis and figure out a measure that's basically an index of the separation between those two distributions. We can do that for each point in time, and we can do that for each of these 4 plots. So that's what I've done here, and now this is averaged across all 8 subjects, and the shaded regions are confidence intervals. Okay, so magenta now here is the foveal analysis, and green is peripheral selection. So this ROC measure is really just a measure, is a better measure of the predictive validity of noise on these different tasks, if you like. Okay. Essentially, these graphs are showing you a very similar thing to the previous graphs. Okay? So aligned on the start of the test sequence, we see that we extract tilt information from the fovea and contrast information from the periphery pretty much at the same time, and it kind of gradually converges to back to baseline. So no predictive power is 0.5 in this context. And peripheral selection reaches that much earlier. Actually, I think the more informative graph is this one here, where we look at these data aligned on movement onset. So here what you can see is that you're extracting foveal information effectively throughout the entire fixation duration, right up to movement onset. And you get this lovely drop down to baseline right at the start of the movement, and then actually it climbs up again a little bit after the movement. So even though you've moved away, information at this location is still influencing your judgment at the end. Peripheral selection, you have a very similar curve, but it drops down to baseline sometime before the movement, and this would be the dead time. So under these conditions, this particular task, foveal analysis and peripheral selection occur in parallel. Okay? And the foveal analysis continues right up to movement onset. And so this is the paper that we recently published in PNS.
So just before we go further,
Yeah.
it's complicated.
It is, yeah, yeah.
I want to just clear that I understand it. So in this thing, you put the noise into the tilt
Yeah.
for 3 frames, is that correct?
No. It's throughout the
Throughout.
sequence. Yeah. Yeah. So the sequence is 750 milliseconds. So for each trial, we've got a sequence of 32 noise samples.
But the onset of it is the onset of the noise with respect to the onset of the stimulus is delayed. Am I wrong about that?
So I think of the onset of the stimulus as the onset of the noise. The early part of the trial, there is no information in the display to allow you to do the task. You have this preview period where you're just looking at the vertical patches,
Okay.
just to get rid of the transients that otherwise. If you're staring at nothing in particular and then all of a sudden stuff comes up and starts wiggling, then the early information might become really important just because of that transient. And so we wanted to remove that transient as much as we could. So yeah, in everything I've ignored that first part of the trial.
So I think this is really interesting. One thing that I thought of is that it kind of provides evidence refuting a strong, what is the name of it? The theory of attention, premotor theory of attention, right? Where you obligatorily shift attention to locations where you're programming an eye movement. Because essentially what you demonstrated is that you can continue foveal analysis while you're selecting the saccade target. That's pretty neat.
Okay, yeah, that occurred to me. Yeah. Bearing in mind that these are, we get several effects where I think, bearing in mind that these are different dimensions, we get several effects whereby our findings don't seem very consistent with a kind of unitary view of an attentional mechanism. So for example, one of our findings, to try to get this right, so one of our findings is that, so in this part of the trial you're processing the contrast information in the periphery, but at some point later in the trial, but before you've moved, you're starting to process the orientation information at the upcoming fixation location. And so again, that wouldn't seem consistent with if you think of a kind of spotlight mechanism that, then you would say, well, during this period, if you're attending to these peripheral patches, then you would also be picking up the tilt information from those patches. Actually, that doesn't seem to be the case. You pick up the tilt information once you've selected the patch that you're going to look at.
I was going to ask you if you plotted this on the orientation judgment of the peripheral, the noise in the peripheral orientation, instead of the noise at the initial orientation, what would that look like? And what you just said suggests to me that it's going to be at zero at chance until you move your eyes. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I've got a graph at the end which I can show you. But if I flick through it now, then I'm giving away all my other results.
Yeah.
There aren't that many other results. The second question is pretty straightforward to deal with.
Can I ask you another question?
Yeah.
So, the eye-brain lag is about 50, 60 milliseconds. So what I'm wondering is why the use of the jiggle air is not being used for foveal analysis during the actual duration of the saccade that's being executed. Right? There's this nice clean drop down, and then the saccade ends, it picks back up again. But you would think if there was
I think you may be processing the tilt values that were presented earlier. It's just that wouldn't show up in this graph.
Why
So
not?
Well, okay, so say so the tilt samples presented at this point in time, for example,
Right.
I can imagine, and something that has to be true, that really you're integrating those tilt samples with the earlier tilt samples, so you're processing those tilt samples in this actual period of time. But this is all referenced not with respect to the time at which you were processing these things in your brain. This is all referenced with respect to the time at which these samples were presented on the screen.
Right, I understand that. Let me talk about it later.
Yeah.
But I mean, hold on.
Yeah.
So, see, one of the things we've argued is that, you only need a small burst of visual information, just a short period of visual information, and disparate text and stuff that we've done. Those experiments that we did where we made words disappear or we blind them.
Yeah.
And so, it feels like this thing is it feels like what you're saying is, look, you're extracting information right through, right? And that seems to be important in terms of these two dependent measures that you've got, right? But when we did those studies, what we were showing was we could basically discontinue your perceptual experience, that there were no behavioural consequences, little by way of behavioural consequences. There seems to be some contradiction there, and I'm wondering if that's to do with the fact that your stimuli are dynamic, right, and our stimuli were very static.
Yes.
Although, when we discontinued them in one experiment, we did replace them with something else, so there was a transient, right?
But I think here, in some ways, it's adaptive to keep integrating the information as it comes in. Because by integrating for longer and longer, you're averaging out the noise.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
So it's almost like there's an advantage to do that in your experiment over ours, right? Where everything was just static.
I'll very quickly deal with this second experiment. It just occurred to me that, having done this study, that actually this is a really nice paradigm to look at this particular question. So, to what extent is this when decision, fixation duration, controlled by foveal analysis or peripheral selection, the quality of foveal evidence, quality of peripheral evidence? I don't think I need to say very much about this, except that, if we take our dominant models of eye movement controlling reading, so easy reader, Swift, it is clear that in those models, one more directly than the other, it is clear that it's the foveal analysis that controls your fixation direction. That may be direct, or it may be because of some inhibitory process that kicks in when foveal analysis is a little bit more complicated. In the kind of models that I've talked about at the start of this presentation, so these kind of target selection models where things are accumulating up to a threshold, in those models, the very strong assumption of those models is that fixation duration is entirely governed by the strength of peripheral evidence. Of course, that's because there is no foveal task to do. But then it becomes an interesting question, what happens if there is a foveal task to do? And so that's the question I'm asking here. When there is both a foveal and this peripheral task, which of these two exerts greater control over fixation duration? So the task is effectively the same as you've seen before, except without the noise. The other thing I wanted to do was to approximate more closely the situation where you have a sequence of eye movements. Okay? So in the previous task, you start off fixated in the center, and you get a patch there, and then it starts wiggling. So here, I get you to fixate in the peripheries, or get you to fixate non-centrally on the monitor. Fixation point disappears. You've got these three vertical patches. So again, this is the preview. There's no information in these patches at all. Take off the fixation point, and your task is to make an eye movement to the central patch. During that eye movement, we tilt that central patch, either clockwise or anti-clockwise. And at the same time, the two peripheral patches remain vertical, but we introduce a contrast difference. So this one's higher contrast, this one's lower contrast. So your task is again exactly the same. So you land at this location, you extract some tilt information, you select a target based on contrast, you make an eye movement there, and actually during that eye movement, you tilt the peripheral patch, and then you make your same different judgment. So the same task, but only two peripheral patches, and we've got that initial saccade and no noise. So what we can now do is kind of independently manipulate the quality of the difficulty of foveal analysis and the difficulty of peripheral selection. Okay? So, we can just simply manipulate the tilt offset. And we can manipulate the contrast difference between the two peripheral patches. And the question is, how is this fixation on this central pattern governed by these two forms of evidence? We should also say that we've removed this very short presentation duration. Okay? Because we wanted, you can take as long as you like on this central patch, but once you've moved away, you've only got 350 milliseconds or so to get information from that patch. But we're not really interested in what happens once you've moved away, so we're really only interested in this fixation duration. So here are just some examples. So this is a trial where the foveal evidence is good, so this is quite a substantial tilt offset, and the peripheral evidence is good, so there's a large contrast difference between those two patches. And here's the other end of the extreme. So the foveal evidence is poor. It's very difficult to see what the tilt offset is there, and the peripheral evidence is poor as well. So a very small contrast difference.
So why are you not so interested in the decision component here, the perceptual? So when they land on the second, they go to the one, and then they go to the second one, and then they make a behavioural response, right? About which will be same different, right?
Yeah.
Why aren't you interested in those responses like you were in the first experiment?
Because here, there is no noise in these stimuli, so we cannot do the same trick where we use the noise to identify over what period of time you're processing that information.
Yeah.
So
there's no noise in those stimuli on that first set of slides. Is there any noise in where's the noise coming in here? I'm not getting
there is no noise here at all.
It's just it just
This is just static. This one, during the saccade, it tilts,
Yeah.
and then it just stays there. And that's just because. So I have done experiments where we're. This is just. So these noise experiments, like I said, I mean, they're kind of extremely brute force. You just shove a load of noise into your stimulus. It's not an experimental manipulation, really. You shove a lot of noise into the stimulus and then see what happens. You're looking for correlations between the noise and behavior. So, in terms of experimental design, it's suitable to answer certain kinds of questions, but I figured this actually was a question that we can answer with a very controlled experimental design. Is that clear? So what I'm plotting is fixation duration as a function of the quality of the foveal evidence. So the tilt offset in degrees, the different lines with the different values for the contrast difference. What you can see, hopefully, is that the variation within one of these lines is greater than the variation between those lines. Here's a different way of showing the same thing. So this is now fixation duration as a function of foveal evidence averaged over the different levels of contrast difference. This is fixation duration as a function of peripheral evidence averaged over the various levels of foveal evidence. Basically, this one goes down very nicely, and as I say, to those of you coming from a reading domain, this makes perfect sense. It's foveal evidence that controls fixation duration. This line is basically flat. It has a funny upward kick that's actually quite reliable. I have some ideas about why this is, but I think the overall message is this foveal evidence has a much greater influence on fixation duration than peripheral evidence, and yeah, that's a fairly clear-cut answer, I think. Okay, and so note that this is quite inconsistent with what I started with. So according to these models, the greater the peripheral evidence, the sooner you should move to the target. And so what I'm showing is that as soon as if you had something to do at fixation here, then this model basically doesn't work. So
But it works for that task.
it works for this task where you've got nothing at all to do with the program. Yeah. But I think this is an important point because people think about target selection and models of target selection inspired by single-cell neurophysiology, where animals get to do tasks a little bit like this, and the data look a little bit like this, and the data are modeled with models like this. And so that would seem like a viable account of when and where. But actually, I'm beginning to believe that as soon as you have a foveal task, when and where are separate things, which is of course what in some domains and early models of ocular motor control, this was a core assumption. But I think to some extent it's been perhaps not ignored, but that idea has kind of gone out of fashion in other domains. I think I'm going to leave it here. I had some speculation about the kind of mechanisms that may be involved in deciding when to move on, but I think I'll just leave it here. some more questions. Thank you.